try to say it's a communist plot. All I want is equality for my sister, my brother, my people, and me. You lied to me all these years. You told me to wash and clean my ears and talk real fine just like a lady, and you'd stop calling me Sister Sadie. But my country is full of lies. We all gonna die and die like flies. I don't trust nobody anymore. They keep on saying go slow. That's just the trouble. Desegregation, mass participation, unification, do things gradually, will bring more tragedy. Why don't you see it? Why don't you feel it? I don't know. You don't have to live next to me. Just give me my equality. 'Cause everybody knows about Alabama. Everybody knows about Mississippi. Everybody knows about Mississippi. Gone down. That's it.
Great. Well, as you may have figured, we are moving into the 1960s this week. Today, we are going to talk about the civil rights movement, the left, and liberalism in the 1960s and 70s. On Thursday, we're going to look at the other side of that story, look at the rise of the new right, and the transformation of the Republican Party in the 60s and 70s. I think for a long time when people said the 60s, it really only evoked one part of that story, and that's the story that we see Nina Simone telling up here in her epic protest song, looking at the early years of the 1960s and the clashes over civil rights. But historians now really tend to think about the 1960s as what they like to call the divided 60s, which is to say that the 1960s into the 1970s are a period in which New Deal liberalism, Cold War liberalism, these themes that we've been talking about in the last couple of weeks, or really last week especially, they come flying apart under challenge on the one hand from movements of the left and ferment from below, and on the other hand from a set of critiques from the right. And so the 1960s and into the 1970s, I think, is really most useful to think about as part of a clash and a conversation about the meanings of the events that we've been discussing, the meaning of the New Deal and the changes that it made in the federal government and in the way business was run in the United States, the legacies of World War II and what it would mean to carry on those legacies in the post-war era, and then the Cold War and the Red Scare that we talked about last Thursday. These really are the reference points for this politics that develops in the 1960s, which is both constrained by the politics of the Cold War in a variety of ways, and then pushed and upended in other ways as well. So as we move into the 60s and 70s, I think you're going to see lots of resonance with where we've been in the last couple of weeks. And one example of that is John Kennedy, who as president, as the Democratic candidate, the first Democratic candidate who is a Catholic, who successfully wins. We had one other Catholic on the ticket earlier, Al Smith, but he did not succeed. And when Kennedy accepts the Democratic nomination, he really tries to articulate this sense that is starting to emerge in the 1960s, that it is both a moment of peril and of uncertainty, particularly in thinking about the Cold War, and a moment of incredible opportunity. And he really, like many people during this period, taps into a narrative of American history that is pulling on many of the metaphors and ideas and themes we've seen not just in the last week or two, but going back to earlier weeks. His favorite metaphor is the frontier. And he declares that the 1960s is going to be a moment of a new frontier, right? That the kind of grand narratives of the 19th century have come to an end, but that in the modern world, there are possibilities for that kind of expansion and renewal as he frames the story of the frontier. And yet he also says that the harsh facts of the matter are that we stand at a turning point of history. We must prove all over again to a watching world as we sit on a most conspicuous stage whether this nation, conceived as it is with its freedom of choice, its breadth of opportunity, its range of alternatives, can compete with the single-minded advance of the communist system, framing this in Cold War terms. But then he asks a question that is the question that Joanne Freeman posed to us in talking about the founders at the very beginning of this course, which is that can a nation organized and governed such as ours endure? That is the real question. Have we the nerve and the will? And so politics is changing very rapidly in the 1960s, but there is also this constant set of references back to the late 19th century, back to the Civil War, because one of the backdrops, especially of the civil rights movement, but of the Kennedy administration, is that it's occurring at the centennial of the Civil War. And there are constant loops back to that. How far have we come? Has it been too fast? Has it, as Nina Simone was singing, been too slow? The kind of progress and transformation that was promised in that moment. And as we get into the 1970s, another big centennial begins to loom large, and that is the bicentennial. And as the bicentennial was approaching, lots of self-consciousness about what it was going to mean. An incredible number of things happen between the centennial of the Civil War and the bicentennial. That's the period we're going to mostly be focused on today. We're not going to get to everything that happens in between, but I think keeping those reference points in mind as we're continuing to develop this American story is useful. What we are going to do today is talk about a few different aspects of the politics of the left, of liberalism, of the Democratic Party in the 1960s. We're going to start out by looking at Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, this incredible moment in 1964 and 1965 that is one of the only moments in American history that parallels the early New Deal in its flurry of legislation and its promises about what's to be. We're going to talk a little bit about the civil rights movement in the context of Cold War pressures, particularly through the lens of Bayard Rustin, who is our narrator this week in the work that the students are reading. We're going to turn to students yourselves and what happens at universities and on campuses, particularly in the anti-war movement. And then we're going to finish up by thinking about what some of the consequences are as they're beginning to emerge by the 1970s. So to start out, in 1958, the economist John Kenneth Galbraith wrote the book that you see up here that's called The Affluent Society. And the Affluent Society was naming something that was almost conventional wisdom by the late 1950s, but it's Galbraith who really distills it down and gives it a name. And what he suggests in this book is that the problems of the Depression have, Americans can declare, been solved by the late 1950s. And that actually the major challenge of American life in that moment, as a consequence of the Second World War, coming out of the Great Depression, that the main problem is a problem of affluence, that the United States has become the richest society in human history, And it's got to figure out what to do with that and what sorts of opportunities, what sorts of moral obligations that might bring upon a society with this kind of advantage and wealth. He points out that this is really unusual in human history, that mostly human history has been a scramble of scarcity, but that something different has happened in the post-war world, and that's going to be the big question of the moment. Now, his argument is that what that makes possible is a reimagining of the American way of life, of a certain quality of life, particularly for the middle class, that a set of things like education and beauty and art and leisure that in most human societies over most periods of time have been restricted to a pretty small sliver of the population, now is a moment when, for the first time, they can become truly mass phenomenon, something that ordinary people can access in a different way. And this really becomes a theme of almost every movement of the 1960s, everyone who's weighing in. So in 1962, when a group of students get together at the University of Michigan and say, we're going to try to figure out what a new left is going to look like in the 1960s, the first thing they say is that the big problem is affluence, right? We are people of this generation bred in at least modest comfort, right? Unlike their parents' generation of the Great Depression, bred in at least modest comfort, housed now in universities, huge expansion of higher education underway, looking uncomfortably to the world we inherit. You see the same thing in the early years of the women's rights movement, the surge of feminism that begins in the early 60s and extends into the 1970s. Right? Betty Friedan starts her famous book, The Feminine Mystique, with a description of this thing that is the problem that has no name, something that suburban middle-class women are finding about their lives. They have all of their material needs satisfied, right? Unlike their parents' generation. And yet, there's this sense of dissatisfaction within all of that. Right? This image of the suburban housewife doing all of these things that signal modern prosperity, and yet asking, is this all? Even in talking about poverty, the problem of affluence is that it has obscured and hidden the fact that there are, in fact, still people in the United States who are poor. That's the intervention of Michael Harrington, who was a great sort of left social theorist of this period. He writes a book called The Other America in the early 1960s, which suggests there is America, right? This familiar America, as he frames it, the one that's celebrated in speeches and advertised on television and in the magazines, that has the highest mass standard of living the world has ever known. And yet we still have these problems of poverty and inequality. So this is one of the things I think that really distinguishes the 1960s, and in particular 1960s liberalism, from what we saw during the New Deal. The big problem of the 1930s is the Depression. Right? The idea that capitalism might be collapsing, the country might be in collapse. It is a politics of scarcity, in some ways a politics of desperation. The politics of the 1960s that emerges is much more a politics of affluence, a politics of aspiration, and in some ways, for many liberals, a promise to finish the things that the New Deal had started but failed to accomplish. And that is really Lyndon Johnson's agenda when he becomes president in late 1963, once John Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas, one of the first great traumas of the 1960s, of an era that is going to see dramatic political violence and in some ways escalating political violence over the course of the decade. In 1964, as Lyndon Johnson is taking over the presidency, as he's looking ahead to the fact that he's going to have to run as a candidate if all goes well, pretty quickly in 1964, he doubles down on this affluence theme. He says, we are citizens of the richest and most fortunate nation in the history of the world. And he goes on to say that this makes the 1960s a great moment of opportunity. He declares a war on poverty, one of his signature ideas, and he also begins to introduce this idea of the Great Society and of Great Society liberalism, which is the theme of his presidency in terms of domestic politics. And the phrase Great Society means exactly what it says, that we're not just trying to be a stable society, we're not just trying to be a functional society, a livable society, that this is a moment of opportunity to become a great society. And Lyndon Johnson has ideas about how to do that. Now, there are a couple of things going on here. One is that this is very broad language and a very high set of expectations, and setting expectations high can sometimes be a good thing in politics, and sometimes it can be setting yourself up for critique, disappointment, and a sense of unmet expectations. The other is that while this is an aspirational politics, it's also a defensive politics, that the Great Society, like many other movements of the period, is being articulated also as a strategy for fighting the Cold War. That one of the things that's happening in the Cold War is not just a struggle about territory, a struggle about decolonization that is going on around the world in the 1960s, a struggle for hearts and minds. This is a struggle about who can present itself in all of that as the society that most effectively yields the good life, right? It is a competition between two models of life. And Lyndon Johnson says, we're going to use the Great Society to show that the United States is the righteous victor in the Cold War. Johnson himself is an interesting figure because he is, first of all, a Southern Democrat. He's from Texas, and he really comes up through New Deal politics. He works in the Roosevelt administration. He gets elected to Congress in the 1940s as a true Southern Democrat. But he is also very ambitious and very conscious about what the limits of being labeled a Southern Democrat might be, right? If we think back about our New Deal coalition, we said it's this very big tent, but it's also an awkward coalition. You have the Solid South, which is the white South, in which most Black people cannot vote. You have Black voters in the North who start voting with Franklin Roosevelt in 1936. You have this massive labor movement that has come into being and really reaches its peak in the 1950s. You have the urban political machines of the North, and then you have elite liberals. And everyone's together in this strange democratic coalition. The South has a very distinctive role in that, and Johnson believes that no Southern Democrat can really have a national profile because the question of race, civil rights, and Jim Crow is starting, even in the 1940s, to become so prominent in national politics. And so he staked out a role for himself as the one Southern Democrat, there are a few others, but not many, who wants to stand aside from that block, be a little bit different. It's how he ends up on John Kennedy's ticket as the vice president. Kennedy knows he needs the South, and Johnson is one of the only Southerners that many liberals of the Kennedy bent want on the ticket. So he's been very careful, very self-conscious about doing this in the mid-1950s. He does not join in the massive resistance movement for the most part, which is the resistance movement led by white Southerners and white Democrats in the South against the Brown versus Board of Education decision and the surge of civil rights activism that begins in that moment. He really stakes his claim on being a person who can get things done in the Senate, in particular as Senate Majority Leader. And so this is who he is when he is accidentally made president in 1963 and 64. And this is the vision he's coming in with as someone who can get things done and as someone who can particularly get things done in the arena of civil rights. And so these years of 1964, and particularly the early months of 1965, once he has been reelected in his own right as the Democratic candidate, as I was saying, are one of the only periods in American history that really rival the early years of the New Deal for their flurry of legislation. Most of it happening, as with the New Deal, through Congress, through the actual passage of laws, not through executive orders, in part because the 1960s are a period of overwhelming Democratic majorities in Congress. Lyndon Johnson knows what to do with that, and he really takes advantage of it in the mid-60s to push through a whole host of legislative initiatives. So one of the most important, which you can see happening here at the Truman Library, is the passage of Medicare and Medicaid. And the reason that's happening at the Truman Library is because, as we said in a previous lecture, Truman had tried to bring some form of national health insurance to realization in the 40s, was really constrained by the politics of the Red Scare in that moment. But Lyndon Johnson pushes through Medicaid and Medicare, which is not national health insurance, but is two programs, one aimed at older people and one aimed at people below the poverty line. There are a number of other initiatives that are put in place. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which gives the federal government, really for the first time in American history, an overt role in the management, funding, and shaping of local school districts, of state education. Most of that had happened at a much lower, more local level. This changes that, and he's shown here with his one of his favorite teachers in Texas. Lyndon Johnson had himself been a teacher in Texas during the 1930s. There are all sorts of urban renewal initiatives, model city initiatives. There are initiatives to improve and professionalize the police. So the federal government also getting involved in crime and policing juvenile delinquency for the first time in a really significant way. That's going to have consequences later on that in some ways are going to split parts of the liberal coalition. But for Johnson, this activist use of federal power, this finishing off of what the New Deal started, it's all kind of in the same vein. Last one I'll mention is immigration reform. So if we think back to the first lecture I gave about the closing of the gates in the 1920s, well, in the 1960s, in 1965 specifically, that's the moment that really begins to change in a significant way. The immigration reforms of the mid-1960s do away with that national quotas system, open immigration in a variety of ways to a whole set of new constituencies, put other restrictions in place. And it really, if you want to think about how we ended up with a situation of documented versus undocumented immigration that's so much at the heart of our politics today, looking back to 1965 as the place and the moment that really put the system we know best today in place. But Lyndon Johnson frames this not only as something righteous within the United States, but like many great society laws and programs, also as a Cold War strategy. That at a moment in time when the whole world seems to be up for grabs, when the United States and the Soviet Union are battling for hearts and minds, as the phrase of the time would have put it, it was really important to use immigration policy as, in some sense, a tool of diplomacy. That it's very hard to persuade people in Asia that you are their ally if, in fact, Asian immigration is restricted. Same thing for Africa. Very hard, as you're seeing all of these decolonization movements in Africa, to bring people over to your side when your immigration law is not fair to them. And he uses that language of un-American that we talked about on Thursday, kind of taking it and turning it around, saying it was un-American, in fact, to have the immigration system that we had. And here is a new moment of pluralism and opening, as he frames it. And of course, this is going to go on to have pretty dramatic consequences. I think consequences that were not fully foreseen in 1965 when this change began to happen. We've talked a little bit about those. And of course, it's going to dramatically change who is actually coming into the United States as a second era of something like mass immigration gets underway. We're, of course, not seeing mostly European immigration, but immigration from other parts of the world. And then, of course, finally, and perhaps most famously, in 1964 and 1965, Lyndon Johnson signs two of the most important pieces of legislation in 20th century American history, the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which he considers to be the signal achievements of his presidency. Those two, he sees both as a form of justice and righteousness at home, the making up for past sins, for discrimination. But he also sees that as part of a Cold War strategy. And in fact, this whole period of the civil rights movement is in conversation with global movements and with these global imperatives around the Cold War. Not only the question of what do Americans mean when they say created equal, but also what message is that sending to the rest of the world? It's also true that Lyndon Johnson recognizes when he signs, especially the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which bans discrimination in public accommodations, is still the law most significant in how we think about civil rights and racial discrimination in this country. He is proud of what he's done. He says it is his signal achievement. And he also says what this 1964 map suggests, which is that by doing this, he may have lost the white South for the Democrats. He says for a generation, as it turns out, much longer than that. We're going to talk more about the 1964 election on Thursday. For now, I want to turn to the civil rights movement and the protest movements that are so much a part of what is pushing not only Lyndon Johnson, but the society at large to rethink itself, to rethink its politics and laws during this period. When we talked about the New Deal, the big question was who made the New Deal, right? Was it Franklin Roosevelt and all of his fancy policymakers in the 1930s, or was it surge from below? We talked particularly about the labor movement. Well, I think you can ask a similar set of questions about the Civil Rights Act, but about the Great Society more broadly. Who actually made it? And as in most cases, the answer is, well, it took a pretty wide variety of forces. You needed a political party with enough power to push it through. You needed a president who wanted to do it. But even before you add all those things, you needed pressure from below. And that is the pressure of the civil rights movement. As our guide to the civil rights movement this week, we're reading the 1976 book by this man here named Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin is a really interesting figure, someone who was deeply immersed in what historians like to call the long civil rights movement, right? A civil rights movement that really gets started in the 20s and 30s, expands in the Second World War, and then by the mid-1950s with the Brown decision and the Montgomery bus boycott, really begins to take root and flower as a mass movement. Well, Rustin is someone who was there starting in the 1930s as a young man, first as briefly a member of the Young Communist League, right, in the communist orbit of the 1930s when the Communist Party and the far left were among the only integrated organizations that were doing civil rights work. He leaves the Communist Party by the 1940s, becomes a conscientious objector in World War II, which was pretty unusual. Wasn't so unusual in World War I, but it's pretty unusual in World War II, and that is sort of a gesture to his Quaker upbringing. He is a pacifist and especially a deep believer in the role of nonviolent social protest as a mechanism for change. And from the 40s into the 50s and 60s, that's really his signature. He is a strategist, and he is a strategist of the ways that nonviolent direct action, really this new form of strategy that had been used in India, that was being imported into the United States, could be the mechanism that would make it possible for Black Southerners in particular to have political impact and to get their cause seen and realized. Because, of course, the problem that many Black Southerners are facing in the 50s and 60s when it comes to political change is they have to figure out a method for this at a moment that you cannot vote, right? So many of the formal institutions of government are off limits. And also in a moment where resistance, organizing is often met with deep violence. And this strategy of nonviolent direct action, as Rustin sees it, is sort of the answer to that. It's something that can be done outside of formal mechanisms of power. And it's also a method that can take advantage of all of this violence that is so often heaped on Black Southerners who are resisting Jim Crow. It can make that violence visible by staging demonstrations, by having moments in which that violence can actually be captured, first of all, on still cameras and photographs, but especially, as Rustin says in this book, on television. Television is one of the transformative features of the politics of the 1960s in any number of ways, in how it shapes the Vietnam War, in how it shapes campaign advertising, but particularly in what it means for methods of protest. And really the fundamental strategy of the Southern civil rights movement from the 50s into the 60s is to stage a set of engagements that can illustrate to the world the conditions of the South, and in particular, move public opinion in some way. Now, Rustin is a very canny strategist, as you will see in the way that he narrates this story in which he is deeply involved all along. He understands that there need to be direct asks, and he understands that there are very particular vehicles that the movement is trying to move. One is the federal government, that it's going to be federal power that is able to transform things at the local level, and that the Democratic Party in particular is going to be the vehicle for this kind of change. So in his mind, there are a number of audiences for what is happening within the civil rights movement. There's the public at large, there's the Democratic Party, and then there is federal authority. He's also very canny in the sense of his own role. So if you have never heard of Bayard Rustin, there's good reason for that. He's actually probably better known today, because there have been a couple of movies and documentaries about him, than he was in the 1960s outside the movement, because he was mostly a behind-the-scenes operator for two reasons. One was his communist past. Though he hadn't been in the Young Communist League for very long, he was definitely a communist in the 1930s. And as we talked about last week, hugely damaging in the context of the Red Scare and the Cold War. And he was also gay. And so at a moment when homosexual activity could get you fired from your government job, but at also a moment in which it was widely condemned throughout American society, Rustin understood that both of these factors were going to make himself a behind-the-scenes actor rather than the person standing out front. There were lots of ways in which the push-pull of the Civil War, of the Cold War, shaped everything that's going on in the civil rights movement, right? So people, experienced organizers like Rustin, who had a communist past, were often put to the sidelines, forced to hide or evade in one way or another. It was an accusation that was made even against people like Martin Luther King, a Baptist minister, who I think we can safely say was not, in fact, a communist. But it was also a moment of opportunity, as Rustin and many other people recognized, as the world was watching. This is the Little Rock desegregation fight that's being illustrated up here. As the world is watching, that's another audience, right? What is the Soviet Union saying? What is the rest of the world saying? And how can that become a lever for change? And so I think when we look at the classic images of the struggles of the early 1960s, particularly the Birmingham campaign that happens in 1963, in which fire hoses are turned on children demonstrating for civil rights, in which attack dogs are aimed at protesters, many of them children, I think we have to understand these as having provoked moral outrage and political outrage in their moment, but also as being incredibly effective strategy and messaging by people like Bayard Rustin, knowing that if you were in Birmingham, where police repression and police brutality was as severe as it was, this was a likely outcome. And this was a way of showing the country and the world what Jim Crow was really all about. Two other things to note about the themes of the civil rights movement. One is that, like every other movement in American life during these years, they're taking up the question of affluence, right? A lot of what's going on is about access to lunch counters and department stores and new forms of transportation and kind of full participation in this affluent society that has become so much a part of Americans' self-conception. This is one of the original sit-ins in North Carolina, right? Out of Woolworth. There's a reason these are happening at lunch counters, right? It's about restaurants and department stores, about participation not only in political life, but in the life of the affluent society. And the movement was also very self-conscious during these years about taking some of the tropes of American history, of American patriotism, of American past and present, and putting them in conversation. So this is the Selma March of 1965 that ultimately led to the Voting Rights Act. And as you can see, it's just full of American flags, overt displays of a kind of narrative, not only about what the movement was, but about what the country was. I want to take a minute here. There's some technical problems. There's like a Cloudflare outage. I hope this video will work. I wanted to watch just a few minutes of the very beginning of King's speech at the March on Washington. So usually when you look at the March on Washington speech, you hear the famous words, "I have a dream," very eloquent words that he had spoken actually many times in sermons and speeches before that moment. But I want you to listen to the very beginning because it starts out with a story about American history. First of all, about the fact that this is at the Lincoln Memorial, and then looking back to the founding and trying to put those pieces together. So we'll see if this works.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Five score years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned.
All right, so that we're lucky that he said it and I didn't have to read it. That was better than what I would have done. But I think you can see in that speech a story about American history and where Americans stand in 1963, a story about material prosperity and affluence being mobilized as part of the tale that he's telling, and of course, a looking back to that moment of 1863 in 1963, a powerful example of the way that historical anniversaries can actually matter in our politics. All right, so now I want to turn to what happens in the latter part of the 1960s, and particularly to what happens on university campuses as the 1960s goes on. Bayard Rustin, when you read his book, Strategies for Freedom, you will see that his argument is that once 1964 and 1965 happened, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, that means that the age of protest is over, that the nonviolent direct action protests that were used in the South were for a very particular purpose, with the aim of being incorporated into and having access to the society and the political system. And once they were there, your strategy has to change. He becomes, as you will see, particularly critical of newer, more militant groups that start to emerge in the 1960s, like the Black Panthers, like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which undergoes a big shift in its strategy, tactics, and makeup in the 1960s. But of course, his call for the end of protest of a sort is not, in fact, the story of the 1960s, quite to the contrary. And even as the civil rights movement, the classical or Southern civil rights movement, is achieving its greatest aims, there are lots of other groups in American society who are then looking to its strategies for inspiration, to be copied, and to become full participants in this broader cause of transforming American society. So this is often considered the kind of original moment of student protest in the 1960s. This is in the fall of 1964 at the University of California at Berkeley, when a group of students, many of whom had worked in the Southern civil rights movement, came to campus, wanted to do civil rights organizing on campus, wanted wanted to be able to express their political opinions on campus were restricted from doing that in various ways and began what became known as the free speech movement that took off at Berkeley and then on other campuses. At the time, free speech is one of the rallying cries of the left. The politics of free speech looked a little different in this moment than they do in ours, but it is the moment that college students really begin to think about themselves as a political bloc and one that might be mobilized on campuses as well as off of them to participate in politics. And it's worth remembering that at this moment, college students are in something of the same structural problem, not anything like what Black people are experiencing in the South, but they don't have access to the formal political system either, right? The voting age is 21 at this point, and one of the questions that comes up during this era is why it is that you can be drafted into the Army at 18, but you cannot vote until you are 21. It's interesting to think about what might have happened to the politics of the mid-late 60s into the 1970s, both globally and especially at home, if the Vietnam War had not ramped up at this moment and become one of the real structuring forces for American politics in this period. But there is no separating from 1964 on the politics of the Vietnam War from the politics of protest and movement activity at home. These are two pieces of legislation passed by the Congress within a month of each other. The first is the Civil Rights Act of July 1964, and the other is the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in August of 1964, which in many ways is the beginning of the ramping up of American involvement in the Vietnam War. We're not going to go into the details of the Vietnam War here, except to say that as escalation happens from 1964 to 1968, which is really the peak of American involvement, and then as it continues from 1968 to 1973, which is the moment of American withdrawal, it is one of the central questions of American politics, and particularly within the Democratic Party and its relationship to these social movements that are bubbling up from below. For good reason, it becomes the center of campus activity, right? College students, young people are the ones most subject to the draft. But as you can see, the anti-war movement, as it starts to emerge, is immersed in a much broader politics that is about the conduct of the Cold War, that is about the morality of American society, that is about civil rights, that is about broad democratic participation. And so while Vietnam becomes the central factor, it's really part of a big rethinking by young people in the 1960s about what democracy is supposed to look like, how they want to be living their lives, how they want to participate in politics. Now, some of that energy becomes focused on universities themselves as sites of conflict. The photo over there on my far left is from Columbia University in 1968, a moment in which, both in protest of the war in some broader sense, but also in protest of very, very particular things going on with Columbia and the Morningside Heights neighborhood, students took over various buildings on the campus. They occupied the president's office, occupied several other buildings, and are ultimately dragged out by the police. This, of course, has been a reference point in recent years in thinking about what's happening on university campuses. But it's an interesting moment, both because it's a blend of so many different issues, and also because the university, in many ways for the first time, is really the site of the activism itself. It's aimed at getting the university to change its ways as well as the nation. And a lot of that energy is aimed as well at Lyndon Johnson and the Democratic Party. And one of the analyses that comes out of the anti-war movement is that the Democratic Party has become hopelessly corrupted by the conduct of the Cold War, that the Cold War itself has acquired a sort of immorality and a momentum that young people, people who are opposed to the war, no longer want to participate in. And they really go after Lyndon Johnson, who, 2, 3, 4 years before this, is the great champion of civil rights, the great champion of a certain kind of reform liberalism. By March of 1968, he decides that he is such a weakened president, largely because of resistance to the Vietnam War, that he does not want to run for the Democratic nomination again. This leads to a huge set of clashes in Chicago in 1968 at the Democratic Convention about who, in fact, the nominee ought to be. At the time, that was still something that was really selected at the convention, and thousands of young people show up at the convention to champion a more anti-war, less establishment candidate than Lyndon Johnson's vice president, Hubert Humphrey. But ultimately, Hubert Humphrey becomes the Democratic candidate in 1968, and for many people in the movement comes to symbolize the split between what's happening on the ground and what is happening within the broader Democratic Party. Before we finish up, I want to do a couple of things. One is to just mention the most famous moment that all of this arrives at Yale and New Haven, which is in 1970, when for a brief period of time in May of 1970, the world is watching New Haven, because New Haven is the site of a trial of local Black Panthers, as well as the national Black Panther leader, Bobby Seale, who is on trial on charges of murder. This becomes a highly politicized trial, and thousands of activists from all over the country end up coming to Yale and coming to the New Haven Green. And it's one of the things, students, if you haven't already read or written your archive paper, that you can explore. Yale has great materials about all of this. A few other examples of the mass mobilization that was happening in New Haven around these politics in the 1970s. All right, in finishing up, so what are some of the consequences of this moment of organizing from below as it intersects with the Democratic Party, with Cold War liberalism? As we finish up, I want to mention 3 things. One is that not only was Bayard Rustin not correct that this was going to be the moment to turn away from protest. Of course, as the 60s and 70s go on, you see the flowering of all sorts of protest movements that are using some of the forms, particularly nonviolent direct action protest, as their main strategy and tactic during this period. We see movements building around racial and ethnic identity of varying sorts. We have some photos here of Asian American organizing in California, of the Young Lords in New York, Puerto Rican organizing, as well as of the American Indian movement, which is taking off during these years. As time goes on, we begin to see the gay liberation movement, the women's liberation movement, and by the mid to late 70s, we're seeing other issue movements, the environmental movement, the mobilization of disabled people and activists, and many of them are really taking the civil rights movement as their tactical model. And I think even, I would argue, making the idea of protest, nonviolent direct action, street protest, kind of showing up in person as really part of the political style of the left that had not been true nearly as much before this moment, but becomes absolutely essential to how left movements organize themselves, how they think about themselves, for better or for worse. Another thing that happens is that the political system begins to change. There's a wave of reform in response to all of this. One of those pieces is that 18-year-olds, in fact, get the right to vote through constitutional amendment. But there are a series of other changes trying to adjust the political system to make it more responsive to the kinds of claims that people are making. We're going to talk a little bit more about those on Thursday. And finally, this movement surge of the era, both from the left, from liberals, from below and from above, leads to a new generation of politicians coming into power for the first time. You can see here in the 1970s, it's the era when you get the rise of the Congressional Black Caucus, when you get the Women's Caucus, the Hispanic Caucus, because for the first time in American history, you have enough people of these different backgrounds actually running for office and participating in politics. So I want to end now with one of those people making a speech at the 1976 Democratic Convention. Her name is Barbara Jordan. She is the first Black woman ever to speak at a Democratic convention, or I would think at any major party convention in American history. And a couple of things to note about what she has to say here. First, she's speaking in 1976, so she's thinking about the bicentennial and creating her own story about American history. And I think you'll also hear in her words the sense that a lot of those big aspirations, those big hopes, the new frontier, unparalleled affluence, have become much more constrained by the mid-1970s. We're going to talk a little more about why that happens on Thursday, but let's finish up with Barbara Jordan and what she has to say in this moment.
I could list the many problems which Americans have. I could list the problems which cause people to feel cynical, angry, frustrated. Problems which include lack of integrity in government, the feeling that the individual no longer counts, the reality of material and spiritual poverty, the feeling that the grand American experiment is failing or has failed. I could recite these problems, and then I could sit down and offer no solutions. But I don't choose to do that either. The citizens of America expect more. They deserve and they want more than a recital of problems. We are a people in a quandary about the present. We are a people in search of our future. We are a people in search of a national community. We are a people trying not only to solve the problems of the present, unemployment, inflation, but we are attempting on a larger scale to fulfill the promise of America. We are attempting to fulfill our national purpose to create and sustain a society in which all of us are equal.
She goes on to say that the challenge of that moment is not to give up on American politics, not to give up on political participation, but in fact, to find a new narrative for the country that will work for a new era. So that's where we were going. We may see that at some other point. You can look it up online. For now, we'll finish out with one of the great anti-war anthems of the late 60s.